The vampire king found his maid kneeling before his wife's portrait again, her whispered sorries echoing through the empty hall. What he didn't know was that she'd been the servant who'd failed to warn the queen about the assassination plot, and guilt was slowly killing her mortal heart. The fortress of Shadowmere Castle carved itself from black granite cliffs that jutted into the mist like broken teeth, its towers disappearing into perpetual fog that rolled up from the valley below. The ancient stones held secrets in their veins, whispered promises of power and protection that had sheltered the vampire nobility for centuries. But now the halls echoed with a different kind of whisper, the hollow sound of footsteps that belonged to the living dead. Lucian Draven moved through his domain like a specter haunting his own reign, his presence a shadow that flickered between torchlight and darkness. 3 months had passed since Queen Evangeline's blood had stained the marble floors of the Great Hall. 3 months since her laughter had died with her final breath, and still the vampire king could not find peace in the silence that followed. His servants scattered before him like autumn leaves in a storm wind, their fear a tangible thing that clung to the air and made even the bravest among them walk on silent feet. The castle had become a tomb, beautiful and cold, where grief prowled the corridors with predatory hunger. It was into this atmosphere of mourning and terror that Mira Ashford had arrived, a slip of a girl with eyes like winter skies and hands that trembled when she thought no one was watching. She had presented herself at the servants' entrance one rain-soaked evening, her references impeccable, but her manner strange, as if she carried secrets heavier than her slight frame should bear. Marcus, the head butler who had served the castle for 40 years, had examined her credentials with the thoroughness of a man who trusted nothing and no one since the Queen's death. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from. And what time is it? It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. Lady Catherine Ashford vouched for her youngest daughter's character, claiming the girl needed honest work after a scandal had touched their minor noble house. The story was plausible enough, common enough, the kind of gentle fall from grace that sent aristocratic daughters into service with wealthy families. But Marcus watched Mira with the eyes of a man who had survived palace intrigue by noticing details others missed, and there were things about this new maid that made his instincts prickle with unease. She moved through the castle with a familiarity that should have taken weeks to develop, knowing without being told which corridors led to the royal quarters and which staircases the staff preferred for carrying heavy loads. When assigned to clean the Queen's former chambers, she had not needed directions to find the room, had not hesitated at the threshold like others who felt the lingering presence of royal ghosts. Instead, she had entered with the sure steps of someone returning home, her fingers trailing along surfaces with the kind of reverence reserved for sacred spaces. The vampire king's supernatural senses caught fragments of her presence throughout the castle, the scent of lavender and sorrow that seemed to follow in her wake, the sound of her heartbeat that fluttered like a caged bird whenever she passed through the royal wing. But it was the nights that drew his attention most completely, those dark hours when even vampires sought solitude and the castle settled into its deepest quiet. Lucian's hearing, sharp enough to catch whispers through stone walls, began to detect a pattern in the silence. Soft footsteps descended the grand staircase well past midnight, moving with careful precision to avoid the creaking boards that would announce an intruder's presence. The sound always stopped in the great hall, before Evangeline's portrait that dominated the space with its imposing golden frame, and eyes that seemed to follow observers with accusatory intensity. Then came the whispers, words too soft for human ears, but clear as bells to Lucian's enhanced senses. The voice belonged to Mira, he realized after the third night of listening, her tone carrying a weight of sorrow that seemed impossible for someone so young to bear. She spoke to the painted image, as if Evangeline could hear her, as if the dead queen might offer absolution for sins the vampire king could not yet comprehend. The words she chose were fragments of a larger confession, pieces of guilt that she scattered like breadcrumbs through the echoing space. Sometimes she would say, "Forgive me," in a voice so broken it made Lucian's dead heart ache with sympathy he thought he had lost forever. Other times her apologies were more specific, references to failures and betrayals that made no sense from a servant who had never known the living queen. Night after night, Lucian found himself drawn to the shadows near the great hall, his own grief temporarily forgotten in the face of this mystery that had entered his domain, wearing the face of innocence. The ritual became more elaborate as the weeks passed, Mira's midnight visits expanding from whispered words to careful ceremonies of remembrance. She began bringing offerings to the portrait, white roses that she somehow procured despite the castle's isolation and the approaching winter that made such flowers rare as precious gems. The blooms were always perfect, their petals unmarked by frost or time, and she arranged them in crystal vases that she placed at the portrait's base with the reverence of a priestess tending an altar. Her hands polished the golden frame until it gleamed like captured sunlight, and she would step back to examine her work with the critical eye of someone who had performed this task many times before. The words she spoke grew longer, more detailed, confessions that painted pictures of guilt and loss that Lucian struggled to understand. "I should have known" became a refrain that haunted the dark hours, followed by increasingly specific admissions of failure that suggested intimate knowledge of the Queen's final days. Most mysteriously, she would sometimes whisper, "I failed you again," as if she had been given multiple chances to save Evangeline and had squandered each opportunity through cowardice or incompetence. Marcus continued his observation of the new maid with growing suspicion, his experience in palace politics making him sensitive to the currents of deception that seemed to swirl around Mira like invisible fog. He began testing her knowledge in subtle ways, mentioning details about the castle's layout that only long-term residents would know and watching her reactions for signs of recognition. When he casually mentioned that the Queen had preferred the east staircase for her morning walks, Mira's face had flickered with pain so genuine it took his breath away. When he spoke of Evangeline's habit of taking tea in the blue parlor rather than her formal receiving room, Mira had turned away to hide tears that suggested personal loss rather than professional sympathy. Most telling of all was her knowledge of the Queen's preferences in ways that went beyond what any servant should know. She prepared tea blends that exactly matched Evangeline's favorites, combinations of rare herbs that had been the dead queen's closely guarded secrets. She arranged flowers in patterns that mimicked the royal garden designs, and she cleaned the queen's chambers with an attention to detail that suggested she knew exactly how Evangeline had liked her personal space maintained. The vampire king began to suspect that his new servant was harboring secrets that went far beyond a minor scandal in her family's past. Secrets that might explain the guilt that seemed to be consuming her from within like a slow poison. Thunder cracked across the valley like the sound of gods at war, and rain lashed against Shadowmere Castle's ancient windows, with the fury of a storm that had been building for days. The wind howled through the battlements with voices that sounded almost human, and somewhere in the royal wing, a shutter broke free from its moorings to bang against the stone walls with rhythmic persistence. Mira had volunteered to secure the loose shutter when other servants proved too frightened to venture into the Queen's sealed chambers during the height of the storm. Marcus had accepted her offer with reluctance, his instincts warning him that there was more to her eagerness than simple duty, but the noise was keeping the entire household awake, and someone had to restore order to the chaos. Lucian followed her scent through the castle's labyrinthine corridors, his vampire senses tracking her movement as she climbed the stairs to the royal quarters with steps that seemed to quicken with each level she ascended. The storm had turned the familiar passages into something wild and strange, shadows leaping and dancing in the lightning's intermittent glare, while thunder shook the very foundations of the ancient fortress. When he reached the Queen's chambers, he found the door standing open and Mira's heartbeat echoing from within, like the rapid drumming of rain on stone. The loose shutter continued its angry percussion against the outer wall, But Mira was not attending to her stated purpose. Instead, she knelt before the massive fireplace that dominated the chamber's far wall. Her hands pressed against stones that looked identical to all the others, but apparently held secrets that only she could detect. Her fingers found hidden catches and pressure points with the certainty of long practice, and slowly, a section of the wall swung inward to reveal a compartment that Lucian had never known existed despite centuries of residence in the castle. Inside the hidden space lay bundles of letters tied with ribbon the color of dried blood, correspondence that Mira lifted with hands that shook so violently she could barely maintain her grip on the precious papers. Lightning illuminated her face through the storm-lashed windows, revealing tears that fell like silver rain down her cheeks as she opened the first letter and began to read words that were already familiar to her. The handwriting was delicate and feminine, unmistakably Evangeline's flowing script, but the letters were addressed to someone signed only as Little Sparrow in a hand that Lucian recognized with growing shock as identical to the warnings that had arrived too late to save his wife's life. Mira collapsed onto the chamber's Persian carpet as if the weight of the letters had finally become too much for her slight frame to bear, her body convulsing with sobs that seemed to tear themselves from her very soul. She clutched the correspondence to her chest like a drowning woman clinging to driftwood, and in that moment of raw vulnerability, Lucian understood that he was witnessing not grief, but guilt so profound it was literally destroying her from within. The vampire king stepped from the shadows where he had been watching, his presence filling the chamber with an authority that made the very air seem to thicken and darken. Mira looked up at him with eyes that held no surprise, only a terrible resignation, as if she had been waiting for this moment of discovery since the night she had first set foot in Shadowmere Castle. The letters scattered between them like fallen snow, each piece of paper a testament to secrets that had been buried with the queen and were now rising from their graves to demand answers that neither the living nor the dead could provide. The study where Lucian brought Mira was a monument to power and grief, its walls lined with black marble veined in silver that caught the firelight and threw it back in harsh angles that made shadows dance like living things. Crimson velvet drapes hung heavy as blood across windows that looked out over the mist-shrouded valley, and the massive oak desk that dominated the center of the room bore the scars of centuries of royal decisions carved into its surface by frustrated monarchs and their advisors. It was here that Lucian had once held court with Evangeline at his side, her gentle wisdom tempering his supernatural fury when dealing with the complexities of ruling both vampire and mortal subjects. The chair where she had sat remained exactly as she had left it, its burgundy leather still holding the faint impression of her form, and sometimes in the depths of his grief, Lucian would catch himself turning to ask her opinion on matters of state, only to find empty space where her warmth had once resided. Now he placed Mira in that same chair, the irony of the positioning not lost on him as he studied the trembling girl who had brought chaos into his ordered morning. The supernatural presence that emanated from the vampire king filled the chamber like a living force, an aura of ancient power and barely contained violence that made mortal hearts race and sent lesser beings fleeing in terror. Mira sat perfectly still under his scrutiny, her hands folded in her lap with the kind of rigid composure that spoke of noble breeding and years of training in proper deportment. But her carefully constructed facade was crumbling like castle walls under siege, cracks appearing in her composure that revealed glimpses of the truth she had been hiding since the moment she had entered his domain. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, each second adding weight to the tension that filled the air until it became almost unbearable. When Lucian finally spoke, his voice carried the authority of centuries and the edge of barely restrained fury that had made kingdoms tremble at his displeasure. He demanded answers with the kind of quiet intensity that was far more terrifying than any shouted threats, his words falling into the space between them like stones into still water that would either sink without trace or create ripples that would destroy everything in their path. Under the weight of his supernatural gaze, Mira's resistance began to fracture, her breathing becoming shallow and rapid as she struggled against the compulsion that all mortals felt when faced with a vampire's direct attention. The truth began to spill from her lips like water from a broken dam, each admission tearing away another layer of the deception she had maintained for months. She was indeed Lady Mira Ashford, youngest daughter of a minor noble house that had served the crown for generations, but her connection to the royal family went far deeper than simple hereditary loyalty. She had grown up in the castle as Evangeline's closest companion, the two girls raised together like sisters in the protected environment of the royal quarters, where political intrigue seemed as distant as foreign wars. Their friendship had been one of those rare bonds that transcended the barriers of rank and protocol, a connection of souls that had survived even when Mira was sent away for her own protection as court politics grew increasingly dangerous, and Evangeline's position as queen made her a target for those who sought to manipulate or destroy the vampire monarchy. The coded correspondence signed by Little Sparrow had been their secret method of communication during the years of separation, a way for Evangeline to maintain contact with the one person she trusted completely, while keeping Mira safe from the poisonous atmosphere that surrounded the throne. Through this network of letters and carefully placed servants, Mira had become Evangeline's eyes and ears in the wider world, gathering intelligence about threats to the crown that would never reach the queen through official channels. It was through this shadow network that Mira had first learned of the conspiracy forming against the royal family, whispered conversations in servants' quarters, and suspicious meetings in abandoned buildings that painted a picture of treason so vast it seemed impossible to believe. The revelation that she had discovered the assassination plot through her carefully cultivated connections hit Lucian like a physical blow. The knowledge that his wife's death might have been prevented if only the warning had arrived in time, making his supernatural fury burn cold and deadly as winter wind. Mira's confession continued in broken fragments, each word seeming to cost her something vital as she revealed how her warning letter had been delayed by cruel fate and enemy action until it arrived 3 hours too late to save the woman she loved more than her own life. The truth that emerged through Mira's painful admissions was more terrible than anything Lucian had imagined in his darkest moments of grief and rage. A web of betrayal that reached into the very heart of his trusted circle and poisoned everything he had believed about his wife's final days. Lord Aldrich Voss, the advisor who had stood at his right hand for decades and had been present at his wedding to Evangeline, had been orchestrating a coup designed to destroy the established vampire nobility and replace it with his own carefully selected progeny who would serve human interests rather than supernatural ones. The conspiracy was vast in its scope and meticulous in its planning, involving corrupt nobles, vampire hunters, and foreign powers who saw the destruction of Lucian's kingdom as the first step toward eliminating supernatural influence from the world entirely. Evangeline had uncovered evidence of this treachery through her own investigations, patient work that had taken months of careful observation and the cultivation of sources who could provide information about Aldrich's secret activities. She had discovered financial records showing payments to vampire hunting organizations and correspondence with foreign agents who promised support for a new regime that would be more amenable to human control. Most damning of all, she had found evidence that Aldrich had been slowly poisoning the relationships between vampire nobles and their human subjects, creating the very tensions and conflicts that he then proposed to solve through his coup. The Queen had planned to present this evidence to Lucian upon his return from a diplomatic mission that had taken him away from the castle at the crucial moment. A timing that Mira now realized had been carefully orchestrated by Aldrich to ensure that Evangeline would be isolated and vulnerable when he made his move. Mira had been tasked with delivering the most crucial piece of evidence, a ledger that detailed Aldrich's financial dealings with vampire hunters and foreign agents, proof that would have been sufficient to expose the conspiracy and bring the traitor to justice. But she had been delayed by what she now understood was a fake emergency involving her family, a crisis that had been manufactured specifically to keep her away from the castle during the critical hours when Evangeline needed her most. The agony in Mira's voice as she described racing through the night to reach the castle, knowing that something was terribly wrong but arriving too late to prevent disaster, made Lucian's dead heart ache with a pain he had thought impossible to feel. The girl's confession reached its most horrifying revelation as she described watching from a hidden passage as Aldrich offered Evangeline the poisoned wine that would end her life, her position of concealment allowing her to witness the murder, but preventing her from intervening without revealing her presence to the killer. She had been forced to watch in helpless silence as her beloved queen realized too late that she was dying. Evangeline's final moments spent not in Lucian's arms, but alone with her murderer, who smiled as the poison did its work. The weight of that guilt had been consuming Mira from within ever since. A burden so heavy, it was literally draining the life from her mortal frame as she struggled to find some way to atone for her perceived failure. Lucian's rage at learning of Aldrich's betrayal warred with a growing understanding of the torment that had driven Mira to seek work in the castle where her failure had occurred. Her need to be close to Evangeline's memory, even if it meant reliving her guilt every day. The Vampire King began to comprehend that Mira's devotion to his dead wife transcended ordinary friendship or even the loyalty of a faithful retainer. She had loved Evangeline with the pure, selfless love of someone who would gladly have died in her place, a bond that made her survival while the queen perished feel like the cruelest possible betrayal of everything she held sacred. Each night when she apologized to Evangeline's portrait, she was not just seeking forgiveness for her failure to deliver a warning in time, but offering her remaining years as penance for the crime of outliving the person who had meant everything to her. The physical manifestation of her guilt was slowly killing her, the curse of self-condemnation draining her life force in a way that no healer could cure because the poison came from within her own soul rather than any external source. As the full weight of her confession overwhelmed Mira's remaining strength, she collapsed forward in the chair that had once held his beloved wife, her body finally succumbing to the toll that months of guilt and sleepless nights had exacted upon her mortal frame. Lucian moved with supernatural speed to catch her before she could fall, his arms encircling her slight form as she trembled against him like a bird caught in a storm. For the first time since Evangeline's death, he felt something other than the consuming rage that had defined his existence, a protective instinct awakening toward this broken girl who shared his grief and had suffered in silence while he had raged against shadows. In her fevered whispers, he heard echoes of his own pain, the anguish of someone who blamed themselves for failing to save the person they loved most in all the world. And he realized that in her guilt and his fury, they had each been carrying half of the same unbearable burden that had been meant to be shared between souls who understood the true meaning of loss. The chambers that had once belonged to Queen Evangeline were the only rooms in Shadowmere Castle that still held traces of warmth and light, their walls painted in soft cream and gold that caught the firelight and threw it back in gentle waves that seemed to breathe with life, rather than the cold majesty that dominated the rest of the fortress. Here, crystal vases still held dried flowers that retained their fragrance months after being cut, and silk curtains in shades of rose and amber filtered the harsh mountain light into something soft and welcoming that reminded visitors that this had once been a place of love rather than merely power. It was to these chambers that Lucian carried Mira's unconscious form, her body so light in his supernatural strength that she seemed made of shadows and sorrow rather than flesh and bone. The great canopied bed where Evangeline had once slept dominated the room with its carved posts and embroidered coverlets, but Lucian placed Mira instead on the settee near the window where his wife had loved to read in the afternoon light, somehow understanding that the girl would find comfort in a space associated with peaceful moments rather than the intimacy of royal slumber. For 3 days, fever ravaged Mira's weakened system as her body fought against the poison of guilt that had been slowly consuming her from within. And during those endless hours, Lucian found himself keeping vigil beside her with a dedication that surprised him in its intensity. He who had raged through empty halls for months now sat in perfect stillness, watching over this broken girl who had loved his wife with a devotion that matched his own. And in her fevered whispers he heard fragments of conversations with Evangeline that painted pictures of a friendship so deep and pure, it made his own grief seem almost selfish in comparison. When the fever finally broke on the fourth morning, Mira woke to find herself surrounded by the familiar comforts of her beloved queen's private sanctuary, and the tears that came were not of guilt, but of gratitude for being allowed to rest in a place where Evangeline's spirit still seemed to linger like perfume in silk. The vampire king sat in the chair beside her bed, his immortal features marked by an exhaustion that spoke of days spent wrestling with revelations that had shattered everything he thought he knew about his wife's death. And when their eyes met, there was an understanding between them that needed no words to express its depth. In that moment of shared recognition, they formed an alliance born not of convenience, but of mutual understanding, two souls wounded by the same loss and united in their determination to see justice done for the woman they had both failed to save. Lucian spoke first, his voice rough with emotion, as he promised to help Mira find the peace that had been eluding her since Evangeline's death. Not through forgiveness that must be earned, but through action that would honor the Queen's memory and ensure that her sacrifice had not been in vain. In return, Mira offered something more valuable than gold or jewels, the network of loyal servants and palace insiders that she had been cultivating for years in service to Evangeline's need for information about threats to the crown. These were not the grand nobles or powerful advisors who attended court functions and made speeches about their loyalty to the throne, but the invisible army of working people who cleaned the chambers and served the meals and heard the secrets that powerful men thought were safe from common ears. Cooks' assistants who listened at keyholes during private dinners, stable boys who noted which horses left the castle at unusual hours, and laundry maids who examined clothing for stains that might tell stories their owners preferred to keep hidden, all of them bound together by their genuine love for a queen who had treated them with kindness and respect when others of noble birth barely acknowledged their existence. Through this carefully maintained network, Mira had been gathering intelligence about Aldrich's activities for months before Evangeline's death, pieces of a puzzle that had seemed innocent enough individually but formed a pattern of treachery when assembled into a complete picture. Together, Lucian and Mira began to map the conspiracy that had destroyed their world, laying out documents and testimonies on Evangeline's writing desk like military strategists planning a campaign against an enemy whose strength and cunning they were only beginning to understand. The scope of Aldrich's betrayal extended far beyond simple ambition or jealousy, reaching into the highest levels of noble society and across international boundaries to include foreign powers who saw the vampire monarchy as an obstacle to their own expansion and influence. Corrupt human nobles who chafed under supernatural rule had been secretly funding vampire hunting organizations, providing them with weapons and information while publicly maintaining their loyalty to the crown. Ancient vampire houses that had lost power and prestige under Lucian's reign had been promised restoration of their former status in exchange for supporting Aldrich's coup, their resentment carefully cultivated over decades until it blossomed into treasonous collaboration. Most disturbing of all were the vampire hunters who had been infiltrating noble households as servants and advisors, gathering intelligence about supernatural weaknesses and vulnerabilities that could be exploited when the time came for open warfare between the species. The web of conspiracy was so vast and intricate that it seemed impossible any one person could have orchestrated it all. But Aldrich's patient genius lay in his ability to make each conspirator believe they were part of a smaller, more manageable plot, while he alone understood the full scope of the revolution he was engineering. Lord Aldrich's return to Shadowmere Castle came with all the pomp and ceremony befitting a trusted advisor completing a successful diplomatic mission, his carriage arriving with an escort of guards and a train of servants bearing gifts from foreign courts that supposedly demonstrated his skill in advancing the kingdom's interests abroad. But Lucian's newly awakened suspicions allowed him to see through the elaborate performance, to recognize the signs that Aldrich had actually been cementing alliances with anti-vampire factions who were preparing for the final phase of their carefully orchestrated coup. The advisor's surprise at finding Mira among the castle servants was carefully concealed behind a mask of polite interest. But his questions about her background and her reasons for seeking employment at Shadowmere revealed an anxiety that had nothing to do with concern for the castle's security and everything to do with the threat her knowledge posed to his carefully laid plans. During the formal dinner held to welcome Aldrich back to court, the tension in the great hall was thick enough to cut with a blade as the vampire king and his supposedly loyal advisor engaged in verbal sparring that seemed courteous on the surface but carried undercurrents of accusation and warning that only they could fully understand. Mira served at table with the other junior servants, her presence unnoticed by the assembled nobles, who paid no attention to the faceless figures who brought their food and filled their wine cups. But Aldrich's eyes tracked her movements with the intensity of a predator stalking prey. The attempt to poison Mira came during the third course when Aldrich personally selected a goblet of wine and instructed her to taste it before serving. Ostensibly as a gesture of concern for the king's safety, but actually as an opportunity to eliminate the one person who knew enough about his conspiracy to expose everything. The vintage he chose was the same rare blend that had killed Evangeline, its sweetness designed to mask the bitter taste of the toxin that would stop a mortal heart within minutes of consumption. And his smile as he offered it to Mira carried the same cold satisfaction he had worn while watching the queen die in agony. But Lucian's supernatural senses detected the familiar scent of poison the moment the wine was uncorked. The same chemical signature that had haunted his nightmares for months, suddenly sharp and clear in the air of the great hall like a bell tolling for vengeance. The confrontation that followed shattered the pretense of civilized discourse that had been masking the deadly game being played beneath the surface of court etiquette. Lucian's accusation ringing through the hall with the authority of absolute monarchy, while Aldrich's mask of loyalty finally slipped to reveal the face of a traitor who had been planning this moment for years. The violence that erupted was swift and brutal as Aldrich's carefully placed allies among the castle guard revealed themselves, their supposed loyalty to the crown discarded in favor of gold and promises of power in the new order that their master intended to establish. Steel rang against steel in the great hall where Lucian and Evangeline had been wed, blood staining the marble floors where she had danced at countless celebrations, and the ancient stones echoed with the sounds of battle as vampire fought vampire in a conflict that would determine the future of the supernatural monarchy. In the chaos of combat, Aldrich proved himself to be not just a skilled political manipulator, but a formidable warrior whose centuries of experience made him a deadly opponent, even for a vampire king whose power exceeded that of any other creature of the night. The advisor fought with the desperation of a man whose carefully laid plans were crumbling around him, his blade seeking Lucian's heart with the precision of someone who had been studying his master's fighting style for decades in preparation for this moment of betrayal. But even as Aldrich's superior numbers and strategic preparation gave him the advantage in the immediate battle, his escape from the castle came at the cost of revealing the full scope of his treachery, his parting words confirming Lucian's worst fears about the conspiracy that had destroyed his happiness and threatened to destroy his kingdom. Evangeline's murder had not been the culmination of the plot, but merely the opening move in a much larger game designed to overthrow the established supernatural order and replace it with something that would serve human interests rather than vampire ones. And the war that Aldrich had been planning for decades was about to begin in earnest, now that his hand had been forced into the open. In the aftermath of the failed assassination attempt, Lucian and Mira retreated to the hidden study that Evangeline had maintained behind her public chambers, a secret room that few had known existed and fewer still had been permitted to enter during the Queen's lifetime. Here, surrounded by maps and documents that painted a picture of the conspiracy in all its terrible complexity, Mira revealed the final secret that Evangeline had entrusted to her care before her death. Hidden within the study's walls was a detailed map of Aldrich's entire network, painstakingly compiled over months of careful investigation, and marked with the locations of safe houses, the names of financial backers, and most importantly, the site of a planned summit where vampire hunters and corrupt nobles would finalize their alliance and coordinate their attack on the supernatural monarchy. Evangeline had been building a case against Aldrich with the methodical patience of a master strategist, using Mira as her agent in places where a queen could not go and among people who would never speak freely in the presence of royalty. The Queen's investigations had uncovered the full scope of the conspiracy against her husband's reign, from the foreign powers who provided funding to the domestic traitors who facilitated communication and coordination between the various factions working toward the common goal of vampire destruction. Most critically, Evangeline had discovered that her own death was not just an act of personal revenge, but a necessary step in Aldrich's plan, removing the one person who had the intelligence and influence to rally the supernatural nobility against the coming storm. As Lucian studied the carefully annotated maps and read the detailed reports that his wife had compiled during her final months, he began to understand that Evangeline's greatest gift to him had not been just her love during their years together, but the tools for vengeance delivered through the guilt-ridden but faithful hands of her most loyal friend, and that her death had been not just a tragedy to mourn, but a sacrifice that had preserved the knowledge necessary to save the kingdom she had died trying to protect. The transformation of hunter into hunted began with meticulous precision as Lucian and Mira turned the weapons of espionage and subterfuge against those who had wielded them so effectively in the shadows of his kingdom. Their alliance forged in shared grief, now becoming an instrument of calculated vengeance that would strike at the heart of Aldrich's carefully constructed conspiracy. Using the detailed intelligence that Evangeline had died to preserve, they began mapping the weak points in their enemy's network, identifying the minor nobles and corrupted servants whose removal would create fractures in the communication lines that held the rebellion together. Mira's extensive knowledge of court politics and noble genealogies allowed her to predict which families could be turned against Aldrich through carefully applied pressure, while Lucian's supernatural abilities made it possible to eliminate the most dangerous threats with a swiftness and stealth that left their enemies wondering if death itself had turned against their cause. The vampire hunter stronghold, disguised as the monastery of St. Erasmus, presented their first major target. A seemingly holy place nestled in the forested hills beyond the capital where monks ostensibly devoted their lives to prayer and contemplation, while actually training killers and stockpiling weapons designed to destroy supernatural creatures. The monastery's location allowed it to serve as a communication hub between various factions of the conspiracy, its religious facade providing perfect cover for meetings between corrupt nobles and foreign agents who could present their visits as pilgrimages or charitable donations to a worthy cause. Infiltrating such a place required a delicate balance of Mira's social skills and Lucian's lethal efficiency, her noble upbringing providing the credentials necessary to gain entry as a wealthy patron seeking spiritual guidance, while his vampiric abilities allowed him to move through the shadows and eliminate threats before they could raise an alarm. The attack on the monastery revealed the true depth of the conspiracy's reach, as documents recovered from the abbot's private chambers showed financial records linking the supposed holy men to vampire hunting organizations across 3 kingdoms, and correspondence with foreign powers who were providing both funding and strategic guidance for the rebellion against supernatural authority. More disturbing still were the detailed maps of vampire strongholds and noble residences, annotated with notes about defensive weaknesses and the daily routines of potential targets. evidence that the hunters had been planning systematic extermination rather than simple resistance to vampiric rule. Each small victory against Aldrich's network brought Lucian and Mira closer together in ways that neither had anticipated, their shared purpose creating an intimacy that went beyond mere cooperation to become something deeper and more troubling in its intensity. The nights they spent planning their next moves gradually evolved from purely strategic discussions into conversations that revealed the depths of their mutual understanding, two souls who had been shaped by loss and united by a determination to see justice done for the woman they had both failed to protect. Mira's guilt, which had been consuming her with slow poison since Evangeline's death, began to transform into something harder and more focused as she threw herself into the work of dismantling the conspiracy that had destroyed her world. The gentle compassion that had once defined her character started to calcify into a thirst for vengeance that matched Lucian's own dark hunger. And with each enemy they eliminated, she seemed to lose another piece of the humanity that had first drawn his protective instincts. The change in her was subtle but unmistakable to someone who had spent centuries observing the corruption that power and violence could work upon even the purest souls. And Lucian found himself torn between admiration for her fierce dedication and concern for what she was becoming in service to their shared cause. During a raid on a safe house in the merchant quarter, where Aldrich's agents had been coordinating smuggling operations that funded the rebellion, Mira displayed a ruthlessness that would have shocked anyone who had known her as Evangeline's gentle companion. When they discovered a vampire hunter preparing to escape with intelligence that could compromise other operations, she held a poisoned blade to his throat with steady hands and extracted information with the cold efficiency of a professional interrogator, her questions revealing an understanding of torture techniques that spoke of careful study rather than natural talent. The transformation from innocent noble daughter to avenging angel was both beautiful and terrifying to witness. Like watching a flower bloom into something deadly and magnificent that retained the shape of its former innocence while becoming something entirely new and dangerous. Their partnership deepened with each passing week as shared danger and mutual dependence created bonds that neither could easily define or comfortably acknowledge. The line between alliance and affection blurring in ways that complicated their mission and their understanding of their own motivations. In the quiet moments between battles, when they tended each other's wounds or shared meals in whatever shelter they could find, Lucian discovered himself drawn to aspects of Mira's character that had nothing to do with her usefulness as an ally and everything to do with the fierce loyalty and passionate devotion that made her willing to sacrifice everything for the memory of someone she had loved. The way she spoke of Evangeline with reverent tenderness, sharing memories of their friendship that revealed the depth of the bond they had shared, created a portrait of his dead wife that was more intimate and personal than anything he had known during their marriage. Through Mira's eyes, he saw Evangeline not just as his queen and consort, but as a woman who had inspired absolute devotion in someone who understood her completely. And this new perspective on his wife's character made his loss feel both more profound and strangely more bearable because it was shared with someone who had known and loved the same person in a different but equally meaningful way. The growing connection between them was complicated by the weight of grief they both carried and the intensity of their shared mission, making it impossible to determine whether their bond was genuine affection or simply the desperate clinging together of two damaged souls seeking comfort in their mutual understanding of loss. When Mira was nearly killed during a raid on one of Aldrich's most heavily defended safe houses, a fortress-like mansion where the traitor had been storing weapons and coordinating with foreign agents, the terror Lucian felt at almost losing her forced him to confront feelings he had been trying to deny since their alliance began. She had insisted on entering the building alone to disable the magical wards that protected it from vampire intrusion, her human nature allowing her to bypass defenses that would have incinerated him on contact. But the mission went wrong when guards discovered her presence, and she found herself trapped in a room filling rapidly with poison gas designed to kill any mortal who attempted to breach the inner sanctum. Lucian's desperate attempt to reach her, despite the magical barriers that seared his flesh with every step, revealed to both of them that his concern for her safety had evolved far beyond the practical considerations of maintaining a useful ally, and when he finally managed to extract her unconscious form from the death trap, the relief he felt was so overwhelming, it left him shaking like a mortal man confronted with his own mortality. The realization that he had begun to care for Mira not just as Evangeline's friend or even as his partner in vengeance, but as someone whose loss would devastate him in ways he was not prepared to face, forced Lucian to examine motivations he had been keeping carefully buried beneath layers of rage and duty. Yet even as they acknowledged the growing complexity of their relationship, both were haunted by questions about the authenticity of emotions that had developed under such extraordinary circumstances, wondering whether what they felt for each other was real affection or merely the desperate attempt of two grieving souls to find comfort in their shared understanding of loss. The captured documents and interrogated prisoners from their systematic dismantling of Aldrich's network finally yielded the intelligence they had been seeking, revealing the location and timing of the Grand Summit, where all the threads of the conspiracy would come together in a gathering designed to formalize the rebellion and coordinate the final assault on vampire nobility. The abandoned Cathedral of St. Corvina, built centuries ago in the mountains beyond the northern border and long since deserted by the religious order that had once maintained it, would host a meeting of vampire hunters, corrupt nobles, and supernatural traders who planned to declare open war on the established order and crown Aldrich as a reformed vampire king who would serve human interests rather than the ancient prerogatives of his own kind. The irony of holding such a gathering in a place that had once been consecrated to the divine was not lost on either Lucian or Mira. The desecration of sacred ground seeming appropriate for a conspiracy that sought to overturn the natural order and replace it with something that served political expedience rather than justice or tradition. The intelligence they gathered revealed that the summit would be protected by ancient wards woven into the very stones of the cathedral. Magical defenses that had been activated by traitor mages who served Aldrich's cause and would neutralize vampire abilities within a significant radius of the building. These protections had been designed specifically to trap Lucian should he attempt to disrupt the gathering, turning his supernatural strength and speed into liabilities that would leave him vulnerable to conventional weapons wielded by enemies who had studied his fighting style and prepared countermeasures for every advantage his vampiric nature might provide. The location was perfect for Aldrich's purposes, isolated enough that the gathering could proceed without discovery, but accessible enough that representatives from across the continent could attend without arousing suspicion. And the magical wards ensured that even if Lucian learned of the meeting, he would be walking into a carefully prepared trap from which escape would be nearly impossible. When Mira insisted on infiltrating the summit alone, using her noble status and family connections to gain entry as a representative of her house seeking to join the rebellion, Lucian's immediate and violent refusal revealed just how much his feelings for her had evolved beyond the practical considerations that had first motivated their alliance. The thought of sending her into such danger without his protection was unbearable, despite the logical arguments she presented about her ability to move through noble society without attracting the kind of attention his presence would inevitably draw, and their argument about tactics became a confrontation about trust, sacrifice, and the growing emotional stakes that complicated every decision they made together. The plan she proposed was tactically sound, but emotionally devastating for someone who had already lost one woman he cared about to Aldrich's machinations, and the prospect of watching helplessly from a distance, while she faced the same enemies who had murdered Evangeline, was more than his protective instincts could tolerate, regardless of the strategic advantages her approach might provide. The preparation for their assault on the cathedral summit transformed the abandoned tower they had chosen as their base into a war room where strategy and desperation mingled like smoke from the oil lamps that burned through the night. casting dancing shadows on walls covered with maps and sketches of their target that revealed both its strategic importance and the overwhelming odds they would face. Mira's guilt curse began to lift during these weeks of planning, not because she had found forgiveness for her failures, but because she had discovered a purpose worthy of Evangeline's memory, a mission that would either restore honor to her name or ensure that her death served the same cause that had consumed her beloved queen's final months. The transformation was visible in her bearing as she studied tactical manuals with the dedication of a military scholar and practiced combat forms with a precision that spoke of absolute commitment to mastering skills that might mean the difference between victory and catastrophe. Lucian found himself teaching her not just the physical techniques of blade work, but the subtler arts of reading an opponent's intentions through their stance and breathing, while she helped him understand the political complexities that his supernatural strength could not simply overcome through force of arms. Their lessons took place in the tower's upper chamber, where moonlight streaming through broken windows provided illumination for sparring sessions that gradually evolved from instruction to genuine partnership as Mira's natural grace and fierce determination allowed her to hold her own against an opponent whose vampiric abilities should have made such contests impossibly one-sided. The nights they spent planning revealed depths of strategic thinking in both of them that their previous roles had never demanded. Lucian's centuries of experience in warfare combining with Mira's intimate knowledge of noble psychology and court intrigue to create a comprehensive understanding of the challenges they would face. Together they gathered a small force of loyal castle guards and servants who had genuinely loved the old queen, men and women whose grief at Evangeline's death had transformed into determination to see her killers brought to justice regardless of the personal cost such loyalty might demand. These were not professional soldiers or trained assassins, but gardeners who had tended the queen's roses and kitchen maids who had prepared her favorite meals and stable hands who had cared for her beloved horses. Ordinary people whose love for their mistress made them willing to face overwhelming odds for the chance to honor her memory through action rather than empty words. The force they assembled was pitifully small compared to the armies that Aldrich could command, but each member had been chosen for absolute loyalty rather than military skill, and their knowledge of castle operations and noble society would allow them to move through the summit's defenses with the invisibility that came from being beneath the notice of those who considered servants mere furniture in the background of important events. The night before their departure for the cathedral, Mira led Lucian through the mountain paths to the secluded grove where Evangeline lay buried beneath a simple stone marker that bore only her name and the dates of a life cut tragically short by the ambitions of those who had valued power more than the peace she had worked so hard to maintain. The gravesite was pristine despite the months that had passed since the funeral, maintained by servants who made the difficult journey regularly to leave flowers and tend the earth around the marble headstone with the same devotion they had shown to the living woman. Here, surrounded by the white roses that had been Evangeline's favorite and the ancient oak trees that had witnessed centuries of joy and sorrow, both Lucian and Mira spoke final words to the woman whose death had brought them together and whose memory would guide them through the trials ahead. Lucian's words were simple and direct, a promise that justice would be done and that those responsible for her murder would face the consequences of their treachery, while Mira's longer speech wove together memories of their friendship with vows that Evangeline's vision of peace between human and vampire would not die with her, but would be preserved through whatever sacrifices the future might demand. The moment carried a strange peace, despite the violence they were planning, as if Evangeline's spirit truly lingered in this quiet place and offered her blessing to their dangerous mission. And when they finally turned away from the grave, both felt a lightness that had been absent since the night of her death. Not the end of grief, but the beginning of purpose that would transform their pain into something constructive rather than merely destructive. The infiltration of the cathedral began before dawn, on a morning when mountain mists provided perfect cover for their approach to the ancient building that had once been a place of worship but now hosted gatherings dedicated to the systematic destruction of supernatural nobility. Mira's transformation into Lady Ashford, representative of a minor noble house seeking to join the rebellion against vampire rule, required careful attention to details that would convince observers who might have known her during her previous life at court. And the hours she spent adjusting her appearance and rehearsing the political positions she would need to express tested her acting abilities in ways that could mean the difference between success and a death that would accomplish nothing. Her noble upbringing provided the perfect credentials for gaining entry to the summit. Her family's legitimate grievances against certain vampire policies giving credibility to her supposed conversion to Aldrich's cause, while her intimate knowledge of court politics allowed her to speak convincingly about the injustices that had supposedly driven her to embrace treason against the crown. Lucian and the small force of loyal servants positioned themselves in the forest surrounding the cathedral, close enough to respond when needed, but far enough away to avoid the magical wards that would neutralize his vampire abilities and turn his greatest advantages into fatal weaknesses. The ancient protections woven into the cathedral's stones were more powerful than they had anticipated, creating a zone of deadened magic that extended well beyond the building itself, and forced Lucian to fight through waves of weakness that left him feeling more mortal than he had been since his transformation centuries ago. Inside the cathedral, Mira discovered that the scope of Aldrich's conspiracy exceeded even their worst fears. With representatives from foreign kingdoms who saw vampire destruction as the first step toward continental dominance, and supernatural entities whose hatred of vampiric nobility stemmed from ancient conflicts that predated the current political situation by millennia. The gathering included not just corrupt human nobles and vampire hunters, but demons who offered their services in exchange for future considerations, and fallen angels who viewed the systematic elimination of vampire nobility as divine justice for crimes committed during the early years of supernatural rule. The diversity of attendees revealed that Aldrich had been building his coalition for far longer than anyone had suspected, reaching across species and national boundaries to unite every faction that had grievances against the established supernatural order, regardless of their motivations or ultimate goals. The accords being prepared for signing would formalize agreements that went far beyond simple rebellion to encompass systematic genocide against all vampire bloodlines and the establishment of a new order that would place supernatural creatures under the absolute control of human authorities who could dispose of them at will. As the formal sessions began with Aldrich presiding over discussions that treated the extermination of entire populations as merely another item on a political agenda, Mira realized that she was witnessing not just treason, but the planning stages of a holocaust that would make the historical persecutions of supernatural creatures seem mild by comparison. The revelation that some of the attending nobles represented kingdoms that were supposedly allied with Lucian's realm showed how deeply the conspiracy had penetrated international politics, with treaties and trade agreements being used as covers for coordination between enemies who had been planning this betrayal for decades while maintaining the appearance of friendship and cooperation. When Aldrich began the formal signing ceremony for accords that would legitimize the genocide his allies were planning, Mira understood that she had reached the moment where personal safety had to be weighed against the possibility of preventing a war that would destroy everything Evangeline had fought to protect during her brief but influential reign. The summit erupted into chaos when Lord Harwick, a corrupt noble who had attended court functions during Mira's previous life, recognized her despite the careful alterations to her appearance, and announced her true identity to the assembled conspirators with the satisfaction of a hunter who had cornered particularly elusive prey. The revelation that Lady Mira Ashford, known to have been Queen Evangeline's closest friend and most trusted confidant, was present under false pretenses, sent shockwaves through the gathering as delegates realized they had been infiltrated by someone who possessed intimate knowledge of their plans and the ability to expose their activities to the vampire king they were plotting to destroy. Surrounded by enemies who now understood the threat she represented, and with Lucian still fighting through the magical barriers that prevented him from reaching the cathedral's interior, Mira found herself making a desperate stand in the same sacred space where Evangeline and Lucian had been wed decades earlier. The irony of the location adding weight to the words she spoke in defense of principles that the conspirators were determined to destroy. Using eloquence learned from years of listening to Evangeline's speeches and political discussions, she began to expose the true scope of Aldrich's plans to the gathered assembly, revealing that the agreements they were signing would not just authorize vampire genocide, but would establish a system of human subjugation under a puppet regime that would serve foreign interests rather than the welfare of their own people. Her words carried the authority of someone who had access to documentation that proved the conspiracy's true intentions, and as she revealed details about secret provisions in the accords that would strip human nobles of their traditional rights and privileges, some of the conspirators began to realize they had been manipulated into supporting their own eventual destruction. The fractures in Aldrich's alliance became visible as nobles who had thought they were joining a patriotic rebellion against supernatural oppression discovered they had actually been recruited to facilitate their own kingdom's conquest by foreign powers who viewed them as useful tools rather than genuine allies. The cathedral that had been filled with unified purpose moments before descended into argument and confusion as conspirators turned on each other with accusations of deception and betrayal, creating the chaos that Mira had hoped to achieve, but at the cost of revealing her position to enemies, who now had every reason to ensure she did not leave the building alive. The cathedral's ancient defenses shattered like glass beneath the fury of a vampire king whose desperation to save the woman he had come to love transcended the magical barriers that had been designed to contain his supernatural power, the stone walls themselves seeming to recoil from the raw force of his will as Lucian tore through protections that had stood for centuries with the unstoppable momentum of a force of nature unleashed. The magical wards that should have neutralized his vampiric abilities instead fed his rage as they attempted to drain his strength, their resistance only serving to focus his fury into something pure and terrible that burned away everything except his need to reach Mira before Aldrich's allies could complete what their master had started with Evangeline's murder. The sound of ancient stonework cracking under the pressure of his assault echoed through the mountain valley like thunder. And when he finally burst through the cathedral's great doors, the very air seemed to ignite around him with an aura of supernatural wrath that made even the most hardened vampire hunters step back in recognition of a power that exceeded anything they had prepared to face. The confrontation between Lucian and Aldrich became something beyond mere combat, as they fought among the cathedral's soaring arches and fallen columns, their battle carrying the weight of decades of friendship betrayed and love murdered in cold blood, while the assembled conspirators watched in fascination and terror as two of the most powerful vampires in existence sought to destroy each other with a violence that threatened to bring down the entire ancient structure around them. Aldrich proved himself to be far more than the calculating politician he had appeared to be during his years of service to the crown. His blade work revealing centuries of combat experience, and his supernatural abilities matching Lucian's own in ways that spoke of careful preparation for this eventual confrontation. But where Lucian fought with the fury of righteous vengeance, Aldrich's movements carried the desperate precision of a man who knew that failure would mean not just death, but the destruction of everything he had worked to accomplish over decades of patient planning and manipulation. Their weapons rang against each other with sounds that seemed to shake the very foundations of the cathedral as they moved through a deadly dance that had been choreographed by years of mutual observation and the intimate knowledge that came from fighting alongside each other in countless battles before treachery had transformed friendship into the deepest kind of hatred. The revelation that shattered what remained of Lucian's restraint came not through blade or claw, but through words that Aldrich spoke with the cruelty of a man who had been saving his most devastating weapon for the moment when defeat seemed inevitable. His admission that he had loved Evangeline himself, and that her murder had been motivated as much by jealous rage as political ambition, striking Lucian like a physical blow that left him reeling with the implications of what he was hearing. The image of his trusted advisor harboring romantic feelings for his wife, while pretending loyalty and friendship, transformed every memory of their interactions into something poisonous and vile, retroactively contaminating years of shared experiences with the knowledge that Aldrich had been watching Evangeline with the hungry eyes of a predator denied his chosen prey. The understanding that her death had come not from the cold calculation of political necessity, but from the twisted love of a man who preferred to destroy what he could not possess, sent Lucian into a fury that transcended rational thought and threatened to consume everything in its path. His vampire nature responding to emotional trauma with a level of destructive power that could reduce the entire cathedral and everyone within it to rubble and ash. The ancient stones began to crack and crumble as his rage manifested itself in ways that went beyond physical violence to encompass the kind of supernatural destruction that occurred when vampiric emotions reached levels that mortal minds could not comprehend. The very air around him becoming toxic with the force of his hatred as he prepared to unleash power that would obliterate not just his enemy, but every witness to the confrontation, regardless of their guilt or innocence. It was Mira's voice that cut through the red haze of his fury like a blade of pure light, her words carrying the authority of someone who understood the true cost of vengeance and the difference between justice and the kind of mindless destruction that would dishonor everything they had fought to preserve. She reminded him that Evangeline's last wish had been for peace rather than revenge, that the Queen's vision of cooperation between human and vampire nobility was more important than the satisfaction of destroying those who had wronged them, and that becoming the monster his enemies claimed him to be would only validate their accusations while destroying the legacy of the woman whose memory they were trying to honor. Her presence in the cathedral, despite the overwhelming danger she faced, served as a reminder that there were still people willing to risk everything for the principles Evangeline had died defending, and that preserving those ideals was more important than satisfying the hunger for vengeance that threatened to consume his soul along with his enemies. The choice between destruction and redemption crystallized in that moment, as Lucian realized that he could either become the very thing Aldrich's propaganda had painted him as, or he could prove that vampire nobility was capable of the kind of restraint and wisdom that justified their continued existence as leaders rather than tyrants. Together, Lucian and Mira began to defeat Aldrich, not through overwhelming violence, but through the systematic exposure of the truth about his conspiracy, revealing to the assembled delegates the full scope of his deception and the ways in which they had all been manipulated into serving interests that were fundamentally opposed to their own welfare and that of their kingdoms. The documents Evangeline had died to preserve provided irrefutable evidence of Aldrich's true plans, showing how the accords being signed would strip human nobles of their traditional rights and privileges while reducing their kingdoms to vassals of foreign powers who viewed them as useful tools rather than genuine allies. The revelation that many of the supposed benefits of joining the anti-vampire alliance were actually elaborate traps designed to facilitate conquest and subjugation caused fractures in Aldrich's coalition that quickly widened into open warfare between former allies who realized they had been played against each other by a master manipulator who cared nothing for their individual aspirations or the welfare of their people. Most devastating of all was the moment when Aldrich's own vampire progeny, the creatures he had sired and trained to serve as the foundation of his new order, abandoned their maker in favor of loyalty to the crown they had been born to serve. Their choice between personal ambition and traditional duty, revealing that even those who had been closest to the traitor recognized the fundamental wrongness of his cause. The sight of his own children turning against him stripped away the last of Aldrich's composure and left him facing the reality that his decades of careful planning had resulted in nothing but the destruction of everything he had claimed to value, including the relationships that should have provided meaning to an immortal existence. His final defeat came not through blade or spell, but through the complete collapse of the coalition he had spent so long building, as delegates fled the cathedral in terror, while his vampire allies melted away like shadows before dawn, leaving him alone to face the consequences of betrayals that had poisoned every relationship he had ever formed. In his last moments, as Lucian's hand closed around his throat with supernatural strength that could have crushed stone, Aldrich's final words were not pleas for mercy or defiant curses, but a broken apology addressed not to the king he had betrayed, but to the memory of the woman whose love he had destroyed, rather than see it belong to another. His admission that he had never stopped loving Evangeline, even as he murdered her, providing a tragic coda to a life that had been consumed by passions too powerful and twisted to be contained within the bounds of honor or loyalty. He died with her name on his lips, his expression carrying a mixture of regret and relief that suggested death was a welcome escape from the guilt that had been consuming him, even as he pursued his plans for vengeance against the man who had possessed what he could never have. The aftermath of the cathedral confrontation left the vampire kingdom transformed in ways that went far beyond the simple elimination of a treasonous conspiracy, as the exposure of Aldrich's network revealed the extent to which discontent and manipulation had penetrated every level of supernatural society and created fractures that would take years to heal through careful attention to the legitimate grievances that had made his propaganda effective. Lucian found himself facing the enormous task of rebuilding not just his court, but his people's faith in the very concept of supernatural leadership, as the revelation that his most trusted advisor had been planning genocide while professing loyalty created a crisis of confidence that threatened to destabilize the entire kingdom, even after the immediate threat had been eliminated. The work of reconstruction required not just political skill, but a fundamental reimagining of the relationship between vampire nobility and their human subjects, moving away from the traditional model of supernatural authority backed by force towards something more collaborative that would address the concerns that had made Aldrich's rebellion possible in the first place. Mira stood beside him throughout this process, not as a servant or even as an advisor, but as someone who understood the weight of responsible power and the ways in which good intentions could be corrupted by the isolation that came with absolute authority. Her unique perspective as someone who had lived among both nobles and servants, providing insights that helped bridge the gap between vampire and human understanding of justice and governance. Together, they worked to establish new accords between human and vampire nobility that built upon the foundation of Evangeline's interrupted research into cooperative governance, creating institutions and protocols that would prevent the kind of systemic abuses that had fueled resentment against supernatural rule while preserving the stability and protection that vampiric leadership provided to mortal communities. The process was slow and often frustrating as they navigated the competing interests of groups who had been taught to view each other as enemies. But gradually, they began to create something that resembled Evangeline's vision of a kingdom where supernatural power served the common good rather than merely preserving the privileges of an elite minority. Yet even as they worked together to heal the wounds left by Aldrich's conspiracy, both Lucian and Mira struggled with questions about what their relationship meant now that the shared mission of vengeance had been completed and the immediate crisis had passed, their bond forged in grief and tempered by danger, suddenly seeming uncertain when tested against the mundane realities of governance and the normal rhythms of life in a kingdom at peace. 6 months after Aldrich's defeat, Shadowmere Castle had undergone a transformation so profound that visitors who had known it during the dark months of Lucian's grief would scarcely have recognized the bustling center of supernatural diplomacy it had become. Its halls once again filled with the sounds of purposeful activity as nobles and diplomats from across the continent gathered to negotiate the new accords that would reshape relationships between human and vampire nobility for generations to come. The great hall that had once echoed only with the footsteps of frightened servants now hosted formal receptions where representatives from dozens of kingdoms worked to establish trade agreements and mutual defense pacts that would prevent the kind of conspiracy Aldrich had orchestrated from ever taking root again, while the smaller chambers that had been sealed during Lucian's mourning were open to serve as meeting rooms where the delicate work of rebuilding trust between species could proceed away from the scrutiny of those who still harbored suspicions about supernatural motivations. Mira had officially returned to her noble status as Lady Ashford, her family's gratitude for her role in exposing the conspiracy that had threatened to destroy their kingdom, overriding any concerns about the scandal that had originally driven her into service. But she chose to remain at the castle not as a guest or visiting dignitary, but as Lucian's advisor and confidant. Her unique understanding of both noble politics and common concerns making her invaluable in the complex negotiations that dominated their daily lives. The relationship between them had evolved into something deep and genuine that went far beyond the shared grief and desperate alliance that had first brought them together. Yet both were careful to honor Evangeline's memory in ways that made their growing affection feel like a continuation of her legacy rather than a betrayal of what she had meant to them. The transformation in Mira's character was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the castle's renewal, as the guilt that had once been slowly killing her had evolved into a drive to live worthily in honor of her lost queen's sacrifice. Her every action motivated by a determination to build the kind of kingdom Evangeline had envisioned during her brief but influential reign. Where once she had knelt before the queen's portrait in desperate apology, now she stood tall in council chambers where her insights helped shape policies that would affect millions of lives, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had proven her commitment to justice through actions that had cost her everything and restored her to something greater than she had ever imagined possible. The work of rebuilding trust between human and vampire nobility required patience and wisdom that neither Lucian nor Mira possessed in abundance at the beginning. But their partnership provided a balance of perspectives that allowed them to navigate the complex emotions and historical grievances that had made Aldrich's manipulation possible in the first place. His supernatural strength and centuries of experience provided the authority necessary to enforce difficult decisions, while her understanding of human nature and noble psychology helped them craft solutions that addressed underlying concerns rather than merely suppressing surface tensions. Together, they established new institutions designed to prevent the kind of isolation and miscommunication that had allowed treasonous conspiracies to flourish, creating councils where human representatives could voice concerns about vampire policies, and supernatural nobles could explain the reasoning behind decisions that affected mortal communities. The process was often frustrating as they dealt with delegates who brought decades of prejudice and suspicion to negotiations that required unprecedented levels of cooperation and trust. But gradually, they began to see progress in the form of trade agreements that benefited both species and mutual defense pacts that acknowledged the reality of shared interests in maintaining peace and prosperity throughout the region. On the anniversary of Evangeline's death, Mira approached the Queen's portrait in the Great Hall for what she knew would be the final time as a penitent, seeking forgiveness for failures that no longer defined her understanding of herself or her obligations to the memory of the woman she had loved more than life itself. Instead of the whispered apologies that had once echoed through the empty corridors during the darkest months of her guilt, She spoke clearly and confidently of accomplishments that would have made Evangeline proud, detailing the corruption that had been exposed and the kingdom that had been saved through their combined efforts to honor her sacrifice. She told the painted image about Lucian's slow healing from the rage and despair that had consumed him after her death, describing his return to the compassionate leadership style that had first attracted Evangeline's love and respect during their courtship decades earlier. Most importantly, she spoke of the forgiveness she had found within herself through service and sacrifice, not the absolution granted by others, but the peace that came from knowing she had done everything possible to preserve what Evangeline had died trying to protect. Her words carried a lightness and confidence that would have been impossible during the months when guilt was literally draining the life from her body. And as she finished speaking about the new kingdom they were building on the foundation of the Queen's interrupted work, Lucian joined her before the portrait with steps that no longer carried the weight of inconsolable grief. Together they placed fresh white roses at the base of the golden frame, not the desperate offerings of mourners seeking to appease the dead, but flowers given in celebration of a life well remembered and a legacy that continued to influence their daily decisions and long-term planning. The moment felt like a completion rather than an ending, the formal conclusion of a period of mourning that had served its purpose in allowing them to process their loss and find meaning in their shared commitment to honoring Evangeline's memory through constructive action rather than destructive obsession. In a moment of quiet magic that seemed to emanate from the portrait itself, rather than any external source, as dawn light streamed through the castle's great windows and illuminated the painted features with an almost ethereal glow, both Mira and Lucian felt a presence that was gentle and warm, and unmistakably Evangeline. Not the tormented spirit of someone trapped between worlds, but the lingering essence of love, given freely, and without condition, during a life that had been too brief, but had touched everyone around her with lasting impact. The Queen's painted eyes seemed to look directly at them, with an expression that conveyed not judgment or reproach, but approval and encouragement. As if she had been waiting for this moment, when her beloved husband and dearest friend would finally allow themselves to find happiness in each other's company, without feeling that such joy dishonored her memory or diminished what she had meant to them. The sense of her presence carried with it an understanding that Evangeline's greatest wish had always been for those she loved to find peace and fulfillment, that her own happiness had been intimately connected to theirs, and that the guilt they had carried about surviving her death was not what she would have wanted for them during the years they still had to live and love and serve the kingdom she had died protecting. As Mira and Lucian's hands touched before the portrait, their fingers intertwining with a naturalness that spoke of months of growing affection and mutual support, they understood with perfect clarity that loving each other did not diminish their love for Evangeline, but actually fulfilled it, completing a triangle of affection that had been broken by her death, but could be restored in a different form through their commitment to preserving what she had valued most. The portrait seemed to smile as they walked away together, their steps synchronized in the way that came to couples who had learned to move through the world as partners rather than individuals. And there was a sense that Evangeline's vigil was finally complete, her watchful spirit at peace, knowing that her beloved husband and dearest friend were free to build something new and beautiful on the foundation of her sacrifice and the lessons learned through their shared journey from grief to purpose to love. 1 year later, Mira stood in the same great hall where she had once knelt in desperate apology, but now she wore the crown of a vampire queen, having chosen to undergo the transformation that would allow her to stand eternally beside Lucian as his partner in leadership rather than merely his mortal advisor, whose lifespan would limit their ability to see long-term plans to completion. The decision had not been made lightly, requiring months of discussion and preparation as they weighed the implications of binding their fates together for centuries rather than decades. But ultimately, her commitment to the kingdom they were building and her love for the man she had helped heal from inconsolable grief made the choice inevitable rather than difficult. Evangeline's portrait remained in its place of honor above the great fireplace, but it no longer dominated the hall with the weight of unresolved grief. Instead, watching benevolently over a court that had been restored to life and purpose and hope through the patient work of people who understood that the greatest honor they could give the dead was to live fully and meaningfully in their memory. The new queen often spoke to the portrait during quiet moments between the endless meetings and ceremonial functions that filled their days. But her words were now updates and expressions of gratitude rather than apologies. Reports of progress made and challenges overcome in service to the vision of cooperative governance that Evangeline had begun to develop during her brief reign. The castle that had once echoed with whispered sorries now rang with the sounds of laughter and spirited policy debates and the general bustle of a kingdom that had been rebuilt on the foundation of love and sacrifice, and the understanding that true strength came not from the power to dominate others, but from the wisdom to serve something greater than oneself. And in this transformation, the legacy of a murdered queen lived on through the actions of those who had loved her enough to turn their grief into a force for positive change that would benefit countless generations yet to come.